So today's lecture is on elections and voting in Texas. And first, just a very basic overview. Texas does not permit online voter registration. I'll explain that in just a second. Texas does permit early voting. Texas requires an excuse for absentee voting. The polls are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. in Texas on election day, and Texas requires photo identification to vote. It holds open primary elections, and it verifies voter registration and checks the status of absentee ballots. As far as the poll time, just a minor wrinkle. If you are in line when the poll closes, you're allowed to proceed to vote, right? As long as you've joined the line by 7 p.m. A couple of phrases about Texas voters and who votes and who's registered. So there's something called the total population in Texas is about 29 million people. The voting age population is those who are 18 and older. And about 73% of Texans are 18 or older. So 73% of 29 million is the voting age population. That's somewhere around 21.8 or 22 million people. The registered population are those eligible adults who are registered to vote, and there are about 17 million registered voters in Texas. So out of 29 million people, about 17 million people are registered to vote. That's 78% of the voting age population. Now, one factor that a lot of people who live in Texas aren't eligible to vote, and so they aren't eligible to register. There are somewhere around 4.7 or 5 million immigrants, whether legal or illegal. They're not eligible to vote, so they're in that voting age population, but they don't count. But there's a good reason, right, why they're not registered. They shouldn't be. So, voter registration. To register to vote in Texas, you have to be a U.S. citizen. You have to be a resident of the county in which you are registering. So, for example, I can't register here in Henderson County. I'm not a resident here. You have to be at least 17 years and 10 months old. So you'll be 18 on voting day. The deadline to register is 30 days before the election. And prospective voters can request a postage-paid voter registration form online, or complete the form online and then print it out and return it to the county voter registrar. So you can't actually register online, but you can request a form online or fill it out and print it out online, but then you have to mail it in to the county registrar. There are also applications available at many locations: high schools, libraries, the Secretary of State's office, the county voter registrar's office. So every county has a voter registrar, so you can pick up the application, fill it out, and then mail it in. Texas does not permit three things that some other states do: automatic registration, online registration, or same-day registration. So automatic registration is where you are automatically registered to vote when you interact with some government offices, like the DMV. So you go to get your driver's license renewed, and you're automatically registered to vote without even asking about it. And some states do that, about 20 or so. Texas is not one of them. Online registration, I just covered that. In some states you can register online, not in Texas. Same-day registration, again, not in Texas. You can't register to vote and vote on the same day. It has to be 30 days before the election. I kind of already mentioned this. There are residency requirements. You must vote or at least register to vote in the county in which you reside. So for me, that would be Smith County. I have to register there. And unless I'm going to do an absentee ballot, I have to vote there as well. Verification of citizenship. Texas does not require proof of citizenship for voter registration. The Secretary of State is required to, 4 times a year, quarterly, once every 3 months or so, to check the state's computerized voter registration list. And if the Secretary determines from other information they've received that someone on the registration list is dead or has been excused or disqualified from jury service because the person is not a citizen, the Secretary of State sends word of that to that county's voter registrar so they can be removed from the list of registered voters. Yeah.
How do you get by without, with them not checking for citizenship if you can't register if you're not in that county?
It's a great question. If they don't check for it, how do they know if you're not a citizenship? Essentially, they're depending on you not having falsified documents to get a driver's license or something else, I guess. So if you've done that, then, they're probably never gonna know. That's a great question. It's a great question. So in 2019, so just about 3 years ago, the Secretary of State tried to do something that turned out got slapped down by a federal court. The Texas Secretary of State announced that it would be providing local election officials with a list of registered voters who obtained driver's licenses or IDs with documentation such as work visas or green cards. Now, to have a work visa or a green card, unless it's fraudulent, you are legally here, right? To get a work visa or to get a green card, but you are not eligible to vote. So the Secretary of State was going to notify local voter registrars of who those people were, so that they could make sure they weren't registering to vote, which they shouldn't be doing. But I don't know the case, I don't know the details, I don't know why, but a federal judge halted that in February 2019, said they couldn't do it, and the Secretary of State rescinded the order. Now, you can verify online whether or not you are registered. So you go to this page, you can just Google Texas Secretary of State, verify registration. It says, am I registered? And then you, do you have to log in? I guess you do. I've done it before. You just put in your address or your name and stuff like that, and then it tells you whether or not you're registered and where you're supposed to vote. Early voting is allowed in Texas. It begins 17 days before Election Day and it ends 4 days before Election Day. So coming up on November's elections, the first day to vote early would be October the 24th, and then the last day to vote early would be the November the 4th. So you could just go to the polls during that 2-week span and vote in person, but early. Or you can wait until Election Day, November the 8th, and you can vote then. Now, you can request an absentee ballot, but notice Texas wasn't one of those states where it's no excuse. And so, in other words, in some states, it's just automatic. You want an absentee ballot, you get it, and you send it in. In Texas, you have to tell them why. One reason can be you're going to be away from the county on Election Day. So I could request an absentee ballot and say I'm going to be in West Texas on Election Day, so I need to vote absentee. You are sick or disabled. You are 65 years of age or older. So if you're 65 or older, you can automatically get an absentee ballot if you want one. Or you're in jail. Now, so you can vote from jail if you need to. Just request an absentee ballot. Returning absentee ballots. They can be returned by mail or in person. Now, in person, obviously, if you could return it in person, you could vote in person, but you can have someone return it for you. So if I'm disabled or sick, or maybe I'm just elderly, I don't want to go through the hassle of going to the polls, I can request an absentee ballot, and then can have an individual related to me, the voter, can return it on my behalf. That can be a spouse, a child, a parent, a mother-in-law, father-in-law, grandchild, grandparent, a sibling, brother or sister, an aunt, uncle, or a niece. So almost anyone within that close relationship, even great-grandchild or great-grandparent, they can return the ballot for you. For absentee ballots, there is a signature verification committee, and it says each county has one. So what they do is they compare the signature on each carrier envelope certificate, except those signed for a voter by a witness, with the signature on the voter's ballot application to determine whether the signatures are those of the voter. So you've got two signatures that this committee can look at. One is on the application for the absentee ballot, and then the other is on the envelope of the absentee ballot when it's turned in. They compare the two signatures to see if they're the same. They must give individuals, this is a new law, was just signed last September. Local election officials must give individuals the opportunity to correct absentee mail-in ballot defects, provided that officials determine it would be possible for the voter to correct the defect before polls close on election day. So presumably somebody could get a call on election day saying there's a problem with your ballot, do you have a chance to fix it or whatever, and then if they can, then it can still be accepted. There is a site on the page on the Texas Secretary of State Office's website, which is an absentee ballot search tool. So after you have mailed in your absentee ballot, or maybe after someone has turned it in for you, you can go here and track it to see if it was accepted, to see if it arrived. Now, here we're going to get into what's some of the more controversial and maybe more interesting parts. Texas has voter identification requirements. Texas requires voters to present photo identification while voting, and this is the current list of accepted ID. A Texas driver's license, a Texas election identification certificate, a Texas personal identification card, all three of those are issued by the DPS, a Texas handgun license, also issued by the DPS, a United States military identification card containing the person's photograph, a United States citizenship certificate containing the person's photograph, and a United States passport. So all of those have a picture on them, so they fulfill the voter identification requirement. Now, if you are unable to provide one of these photo IDs, you can still vote. What you do is you sign a reasonable impediment declaration, it's like an affidavit, and you provide a supporting document. That document can be a copy or original of a government document that shows the voter's name and address, including a voter registration certificate. It could be a copy or original utility bill, a bank statement, a government check, or a paycheck. It could be a certified domestic birth certificate or something like that. So you sign an affidavit, and then you have one of these other acceptable forms of identification. Who is exempt from showing a photo ID? Voters with a disability, voters who have a religious objection to being photographed, and if you can't provide ID, or if for some reason your name doesn't appear on the list of registered voters and you think you've registered so there's some kind of a mistake, you can cast a provisional ballot. So you sign an affidavit, either stating your religious objection to being photographed or saying that you do not have any identification as a result of a natural disaster or something like that, and then you can vote anyway, provisional. The ballot is a secret ballot, sometimes called the Australian ballot, because this is where the idea became popular in the 1800s. Texas adopted the secret ballot in 1892. Before that, it was common to vote openly. In other words, you would go to the voter registrar, whoever it was, the official counting the votes, and you would say, I am so-and-so, and I vote for this candidate. It was all out in the open. But in 1892, Texas adopted the Australian or secret ballot, where voters mark their choices in privacy on uniform ballots printed and distributed by the government. The ballots are always printed at public expense or government expense. The voters cast their ballots in secret, and the ballots are distributed to every eligible voter at the polls. We also have bilingual ballots. This is because of the Voting Rights Act, which was passed in 1965 and then updated in 1975. It requires counties with an ethnic minority that comprises 5% or more of the county's voting age residents, or 10,000 people overall, to print ballots in their native language. I should have said linguistic minority. That's probably more to the point than ethnic minority. So if 5% or more of the county's voting age residents speaks Spanish, which is very common here in Texas, then they must print ballots in Spanish to facilitate voting for those people. In some parts of Texas, that could be other languages, though. It could be Chinese or Vietnamese, probably not French, maybe in Louisiana, but other languages as well. Primary elections in Texas are open. We have an open primary system. What that means is voters do not have to register with the party in advance in order to participate in that party's primary. So suppose, now the primaries have already happened for this cycle of elections. They happened back in March. But suppose you were really interested in who was going to be the Republican candidate for governor or the Democrat candidate for governor. You could vote for one of those. You have to sign a pledge promising that you're not going to vote in both. And you vote in one of those, and you can, but you don't have to be a member of the party. You don't have to have signed up and paid dues and all that sort of thing. In Texas, employers are required to let employees have 2 hours paid time off to vote unless the employees have 2 hours available during non-work time to vote. So notice the polls are open 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. They don't have to give me 2 hours of paid time off to vote because I'm through here by 5 o'clock every day, so the polls are still open for 2 hours. But if you have some job, and some people do, where you're in at work from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., then they have to give you 2 hours on that day, paid time available, so you can go and vote if you want to. If they don't do it, it's a misdemeanor. They can get fined. Now, the rules for felons, convicted felons, are that in Texas, persons who receive a final felony conviction cannot vote or register to vote, but they can regain their voting rights automatically upon completion of their entire sentence, including incarceration, parole, probation, or supervision. Or if they get pardoned by the governor, then that restores their voting rights as well. So notice you have to complete the whole thing. So not just let out of prison, but also completing probation parole, whatever their other requirements are. And then they can get their voting rights restored. There is a federal law, the National Voter Registration Act, which requires states to make efforts to remove deceased individuals and individuals who have become ineligible due to a change of address from their voting lists. But the law prohibits states from removing registrants from voter lists within 90 days of a federal election due to a change of address unless the registrant has requested to be removed. And they are also forbidden from removing someone from the list of registered voters 90 days before elections, before federal elections, simply because they have not voted recently. So they can't do that. In Texas, the law authorizes election officials to remove the names of voters if an individual confirms in writing that they have moved outside of their voting jurisdiction, dies, is adjudged by a court to be mentally incapacitated, is incarcerated for a felony conviction, is determined to have moved outside of the state, is determined to be ineligible to vote for one of those reasons, or remains on the inactive or suspense voter list through 2 consecutive general elections. Then they can be removed from the list according to Texas law. Yes, sir.
How long do they know? Like, how long after somebody died do they know?
Dang, that's a good question. The exact process for getting updated on it, and I don't know. That's a really good question. Every once in a while you hear stories about people slipping through. You hear stories about, seriously, you hear stories about dead people voting, which means somebody else voted in that person's name, right? How they track those people down, that's a good question. I'm not really sure.
That's like, is that considered fraud?
I'm sorry, yeah, that would be fraud. Yeah, if you're caught doing that, that would be a felony. Yeah.
That's huge.
So how does someone get on the inactive voter list? Anytime a voter registration certificate sent by election officials is returned as undeliverable, or a voter fails to respond to a confirmation notice, they're placed on the suspense or inactive list. And if they remain on that list through 2 general elections, then their registration can be canceled. One last thing about the Texas process, there is something called post-election auditing. So Texas state law requires post-election audits. They don't audit every precinct and every race. They actually audit like 1% or so of them. The idea is to get a sampling. What they do is the audit must begin within 72 hours after the polls close. It must be completed no later than the 21st day after the election. And they check that election results tallied by the state's voting system match results from paper records, such as paper ballots filled out by voters or paper records produced by electronic voting machines. So they're comparing the electronic voting machines and the paper records to see if there are any unusual discrepancies. Now, I want to focus for the last few minutes on this controversy over photo identification requirements. Because it's been an ongoing issue for about 10 years or more, and Texas has been at the center of it nationwide. So about 10 years ago, and in 2011, in fact, 11 years ago, Texas enacted Senate Bill 14, and at the time, this was the strictest photo identification law in the country. It required that every voter present one of the following at the polling place: a Texas driver's license, a Texas election identification certificate, a personal identification card, a concealed handgun license, a U.S. military identification card, a U.S. passport, or a U.S. citizenship certificate. Basically the list I showed you earlier of required photo identification. But the law back then had to get pre-cleared by the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice said, you can't do this. This discriminates against minorities. Texas took the Department of Justice to court, and in 2012, the next year, a 3-judge panel in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia struck down the voter ID law. The court ruled that the law would negatively impact minority voter turnout and impose strict burdens upon the poor. Texas contested that ruling, and it set in motion several years of court battles in federal courts and in the Texas legislature. So the courts were saying, the Department of Justice and the federal court, that requiring photo ID discriminated against minorities and discriminated against the poor. In 2017, Governor Abbott signed another law, Senate Bill 5. It amended the earlier voter identification requirements. It said for voters lacking photo ID, the law established an affidavit option requiring voters to sign a form stating that he or she was unable to obtain photo identification for one of several reasons. That's basically the affidavit that I talked about a few minutes ago. So if you don't have photo ID, you can fill out an affidavit, show another form of ID. The affidavit explains why you couldn't get the ID, religious objections or whatever it might be. But on August the 23rd, 2017, federal judge Nelva Gonzalez Ramos issued an order barring implementation of Senate Bill 5. She said it was not an adequate remedy for the findings of racially discriminatory purpose and discriminatory effect in Senate Bill 14. She was saying, in other words, this bill was still racially discriminatory. It still discriminated against minorities. Texas appealed to the Fifth Circuit, the United States Court of Appeals, and the Fifth Circuit sided 2-1 with Texas, meaning the law could go into effect. There was another appeal a year later, not a year later, about a few months later. The Fifth Circuit dismissed it and allowed Texas's law to stand. And that's essentially the law we had today. So Texas had to fight in the courts for about 5 years to get permission to have the system, photo ID plus the affidavit backup that we now have. So this is part of a nationwide debate over voter identification laws. About 35 states have voter identification requirements. 21 states, including Texas, require voters to present photo identification at the polls. I'm going to present to you 3 basic arguments that you commonly see in favor of and then against having photo identification requirements. So one argument is it prevents voter fraud. This guy is Hans von Spakovsky, is a conservative who has been writing for many years in favor of having photo ID requirements. He wrote, voter ID can significantly defeat and deter impersonation fraud at the polls, voting under fictitious names or in the names of dead voters, double voting by individuals registered in more than one state, and voting by individuals who are in the United States illegally. Voter ID also increases the public's confidence in election results, an essential element in a stable democracy. In a different article, he said, requiring voters to authenticate their identity at the polling place is necessary to protect the integrity of elections and access to the voting process. Every illegal vote steals or dilutes the vote of a legitimate voter. Now, people who are in favor of voter ID disagree with the idea that it decreases minority voter turnout. In other words, they're saying it doesn't discriminate against minority voters. It has no effect on them. Excuse me. In an article from 2019, Von Spakovsky and another guy, Caleb Morrison, wrote, the National Bureau of Economic Research released a study that demonstrated that voter ID laws have no measurable impact on voting behavior. Researchers for the National Bureau of Economic Research found between 2008 and 2016, no negative effect on registration or turnout overall or for any specific group defined by race, gender, age, or party affiliation. Now, I've seen conflicting reports, some that say it does decrease minority turnout, some say that it has no effect whatsoever. So I'll have to study the issue further. I'm not sure who to believe. Another study said no definitive relationship between tough laws requiring voters to present identification and a drop-off in Hispanic, Black, and other minority turnout. In a 2013 article, Von Spakovsky wrote, people in this country need a photo ID for everyday activities, from filling a prescription to cashing checks. You need to present ID to buy a beer or cigarettes, check into a hospital or hotel, apply for public assistance, get a marriage license, buy a gun, hop on an airplane, even just to enter the building that houses the U.S. Department of Justice. Is it really too much to ask for ID when it comes to exercising something as important as the right to vote? So he's arguing it's not really burdensome at all. We require photo ID all the time for all sorts of other things. This Chris Kobach says the same thing. Photo IDs have become ubiquitous and unavoidable. You can't cash a check, board a plane, or drive without one. That's why it's not unreasonable to require picture identification to protect our most important privilege of citizenship. Now, 3 common arguments against voter ID. One is it's too much of a burden for many voters. So the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, is against voter identification laws. 5 years ago, they published a fact sheet on voter ID laws, and one of the things they said was millions of Americans lack ID. 11% of U.S. citizens, or more than 21 million Americans, do not have government-issued photo identification. Obtaining ID costs money. Even if it's offered for free, voters must incur numerous costs, such as paying for birth certificates to apply for government-issued ID. The travel requirement is often a major burden on people with disabilities, the elderly, or those in rural areas without access to a car or public transportation. The Brennan Center for Justice said the same thing. They said about 11% of eligible voters don't have photo ID, and they argued that many citizens find it hard to get government IDs because the underlying documentation, like birth certificates, is often difficult or expensive to come by. Of course, another major argument against voter ID laws is that they might target minorities. So the ACLU said minority voters disproportionately lack ID. Nationally, up to 25% of African American citizens of voting age lack government-issued ID, compared to only 8% of whites. So the argument is that it has a disproportionate impact on minorities, especially Black Americans. Another article says the same thing. Identification requirements for voting reduce turnout among low-income and minority voters. Like I said, the arguments and maybe even the studies seem to go back and forth on this issue. This author argued that in Mississippi, for instance, residents need a birth certificate, which costs $15 and requires the photo identification they don't have. They'll also need time to travel to the state office to pay, or a computer to do the transaction online. So it's too difficult for some poor people to get. And the last argument against voter identification that's commonly made is that in-person voter fraud is rare. So the argument goes that photo ID prevents a kind of voter fraud that hardly ever happens anyway, so it's not really a problem that requires a solution. Justin Levitt wrote this article in the Washington Post. He said, election fraud happens, but ID laws are not aimed at the fraud you'll actually hear about. Most current ID laws aren't designed to stop fraud with absentee ballots, or vote buying, or coercion, or fake registration forms, or voting from the wrong address, or ballot stuffing by officials in on the scam. Instead, requirements to show ID at the polls are designed for pretty much one thing: people showing up at the polls pretending to be somebody else in order to each cast one incremental fake ballot. That is a slow, clunky way to steal an election, which is why it rarely happens. This is the former Attorney General for the United States, Eric Holder. 6 years ago, he gave a speech at the Brennan Center, and he was basically saying the same thing. He says, studies have shown that the actual instance of in-person voter fraud is extremely rare, and therefore he thinks photo voter identification laws are just unnecessary. They're trying to stop a problem that isn't really a problem at all. And that's it. That's where we'll stop for today.